Great Leaders in Oklahoma Scottish Rite. Our second series will be featuring William Busby. This is the second of our monthly series on Great Leaders in Oklahoma Scottish Rite. Last month our spotlight was on Harper S. Cunningham, who actually brought Scottish Rite to Oklahoma and was the leader that built the temple in Guthrie. Cunningham was originally the SGIG in Oklahoma Territory, then both territories, and then the state of Oklahoma. Tonight our subject is William Busby, who was the second SGIG in Oklahoma. Let's take a look at Busby, who was very similar to Cunningham, as both were charismatic leaders who accomplished great things for Scottish Rite. Kind of unique that both of them came from Kansas into Oklahoma and performed their great work. William Busby was born in Pennington, New Jersey in 1854. When he was a youth, his family moved to Kansas, where he lived and worked on a farm. As a teenager, he was a tall, industrious young man. Later in life, you all will recall, he was a large man, 6'3" tall and 260 pounds. His family was quite poor. They were farmers and had tough times in the farming business in those days. And there is no record that I can find of Busby's formal schooling. Now, I'm sure he had some. It must have been at least elementary and no more than high school, because he did not have any higher education, we know. So anyway, but we do know that he was one of those unique and gifted individuals who had a flair for business and making money. That trait would help him amass a great fortune during his life. Part of the reason for his business success was his remarkable ability to get along with people. Now, these traits that I've just listed here would be a formula for success for anyone, anywhere, anytime. He decided that farming was not for him, so he moved to Parsons, Kansas, just a few miles away. His first business in Parsons was hauling wood for customers who used them for both warmth and cooking back in those days. Now, I don't know whether he was the owner of this business or whether he was working for somebody else, but at least that was his first business in Parsons, was hauling wood. And this was now this time period that we're talking about when he moved to Parsons was approximately 10 years after the end of the Civil War. So to put it in perspective. When coal became available, he switched from wood to coal, from hauling wood to hauling coal. And so this was actually his first connection with the coal business. Our next knowledge of Busby's business activity was as a salesman, or you might call him broker, of coal for the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf Railroad, later called the Rock Island. Now, we don't know whether his previous coal business had anything to do with this job or not. I suspect there was some kind of a connection. While working in coal sales, he also built a brick factory there in Parsons. They were manufacturing brick. Now, during these busy days, Busby found time to become active in masonry. Now, this was the speculative type, not the operative type. I thought you might get the wrong opinion that he was making bricks and then going out and laying them, but that wasn't the case. I suspect during these years, Mr. Busby was more of an executive type rather than a working man's type. He was initiated as an entered apprentice in June of 1886 at the age of 32. He was then passed to the degree of fellowcraft and raised as a master mason. Now this was all done in a 3-month period, June, July, and August of 1886. Previous to this Blue Lodge association, he had already been a leader in the York Rite. Seems to me, running through all of this thing, Cunningham was too. He was active in the York Rite. So the York Rite came to these wilderness areas, you might call them, much earlier than some of the others. And it was much easier to start a York Rite chapter than it was to begin a Scottish Rite, because you have to get 4 deals to get started in the Scottish Rite deal. So anyway, so he was active in the York Rite. 9 years later, after he was initiated in the Blue Lodge, in 1895, he received his Scottish Rite degrees in Topeka. Now listen to this. 2 years later, in 1897, he received his KCCH, and then received his 33rd degree in 1899. So he went from a black cap to a white cap in 4 years. That's kind of unusual. Someone obviously became aware of his great potential. The citizens of Parsons had already noted his leadership skills, as he had been elected mayor a couple of years previously. Busby's coal business was becoming so large that he was required to be closer to the action. So he began spending more and more time in the McAlester, Krebs, and Wilburton areas in around 1900. Finally, he made the decision he was going to have to move to McAlester. This decision was not met with great enthusiasm from his family, as they already lived in a big house, had many friends, and were engaged in many community activities. They were held in high esteem because he was, of course, the mayor of the city, so you could see why they were reluctant to leave Parsons. So Busby basically moved to McAlester in around 1900, 1901, and he was basically staying down here in hotels, and then going back either on the weekends, or he'd probably stay 2 or 3 weeks and then go back on the weekends. But he was basically here from about 1900 on. Now, he promised his wife that he would build her a mansion larger than anything in Indian Territory. And he did. He bought a tract of land on a hill in 4th Ward, a whole city block, matter of fact, and began construction. By 1903, the mansion was completed. It was a 3-story stone and wood with adjoining servants' quarters. It had a large carriage house and was also had a garage, which was rare in 1903 because there weren't very many automobiles around in 1903. But he did have one of those early automobiles, and so there it was. And the family moved in 1903. And this is the date that historians say Busby moved to McAlester officially, because his family and residence was here now. But you know, he was here for at least 2 years previously, most of the time. So let me paint the Scottish Rite scene in McAlester during these times, during this 1900 to 1903 period. And I know many of you have heard this before, probably many times, because I've mentioned it and talked about it in previous talks, but I ask for your patience for the next couple of minutes. A Lodge of Perfection had been planted in McAlester in 1901. We talked about that last month. using words of a much greater writer than myself, here's the way he described the existing lodge and Lodge of Perfection in McAlester in 1903. He said, "The Blue Lodge was not doing well. As a matter of fact, it languished in a stupor closely resembling death." Man, that's a flowery way to say the thing was nearly dead. But let me read that again to you. It languished in a stupor closely resembling death. Man, that's a great way to put it. Well, anyway, then a 33rd degree moved in from Kansas in the form of William Busby. If this scene was a melodrama, you could hear the cavalry coming to rescue the lodge. Busby was on the way. Well, Harper Cunningham, our last month's subject, was now SGIG in both territories. Guthrie was in good shape, so now he desperately wanted to see some activity in Indian Territory. Cunningham was aware that a 33rd degree in the form of a guy named Busby had just moved in, and rumor has it that the SGIG told him that if he would revive this McAlester LOP, he would name him his deputy, and he would succeed him when he left. Now, whether this is a rumor, nobody knows whether this was true or not, but this is exactly what happened. Anyway, within 6 months, this would be 1904, Busby's charismatic leadership began to work. A frame building was built, and costumes and pretty crude props were in place. This was called a tabernacle, to indicate that this was a temporary and a real temple would follow. This is how it happened. Busby gathered together a gang of 6. Each signed a note at the bank, including Busby, which would make 7, for $1,000, which gave them the funds to build and equip the tabernacle. And this was located on 2nd and Washington. And by the way, the tabernacle is also pictured in that program that I sent around. Anyway, the gang of 6 were Frank Craig, Daniel Haley, James Elliott, Ed Ferris, and Perry Freeman. Now, of this gang of 6, 2 became SGIGs, and 1 a deputy of the Supreme Council, and the others held leaderships also. So, this is the point I made earlier, was that Mr. Busby had some help. He had some great guys under him. Temporary charters were granted to after the frame building was built. Temporary charters were granted to the other 3 lodges, which completed the consistory. So the first class, called the Alpha class, presented all 29 degrees to a very large class of 96 candidates in 1905. Thus, Scottish Rite was now established in Indian Territory. Before the tabernacle was completed, a building committee was appointed to plan and build the real temple. And of course, Busby was the chairman. In fast-forward manner, let me outline what they did. First of all, Busby selected the property that he wanted the temple to be on, and it happened to be the site of our current temple. And he and Daniel Haley paid for the land and the residence that was on this property. There's more of a story behind that, but we're trying to stick here with Busby. Busby selected the architect and then told him what he wanted. Busby himself then served as the contractor. He paid all the bills during construction and then allowed the temple to repay in installments over the next 10 years. Now, this is what we call today the red brick building, to distinguish it from the buff brick building which we're in right now. Because William Busby bought the land, built the building, and financed it, I have called that first building Busby's Baby, and I think it's very appropriate. The grand opening and dedication of the building, the red brick building, was incorporated with the first reunion, and that all took place on April 22nd, 1907. And that's the program that I passed around. And this truly was a grand affair, as the Grand Commander, James D. Richardson, and his entourage from West Washington, D.C., came to see this miracle in the wilderness of Indian Territory. And you know, this really was a miracle, considering that 4 years previous, McAlester was an ailing, temporary Lodge of Perfection with a withering membership and no enthusiasm, to an active consistory, listen to this, over 1,000 members, and a large temple had been built. 4 years' time. And this is the miracle that we talk about. This miracle was orchestrated by William Busby. No doubt he had some help from the Gang of Six and numerous others, but he was the catalyst. While Mr. Busby, now called Colonel in the community of McAlester, had just pulled off the miracle on Adams Street, he was also doing the same for his adopted city, McAlester. I will list for you just a few of the community accomplishments because there are too many, and we don't. The talk is about masonry and not about community. But he went, while he was here, he went from an employee in sales to ownership of 4 working coal mines. At one time, he employed over 3,000 miners. He was a builder of the Busby Hotel, Busby Theater, Busby Office Building. He built and operated another brick manufacturing company. It was over in Northtown, and Brick Street, if anybody knows where Brick Street is, that was the street that the brick company was on. Anyway, he must have figured out this brick manufacturing stuff is a pretty good deal. He took over the struggling trolley lines and the ailing telephone system and brought them back to a profitable status, and then resold them back to their original owners. He was president of the Board of Trustees of the First Presbyterian Church when they purchased the land on which their current building is located. I just wonder what kind of a building the First Presbyterian Church would be if Busby was still alive when it was actually constructed. I don't know, he with his ideas. Anyway, since this talk is about William Busby, the Mason, I won't go on into many of the other lesser activities of community development. I'll make this statement, the same statement I made last month about Harper Cunningham. How did these guys find the time to accomplish all that they did? Unbelievable. And you know, back in those days, they didn't have a cell phone where they call and get all these things done. So it was really amazing. Back to masonry. We left the Colonel in the triumph of the dedication of his first temple. In 1909, Harper Cunningham decided to leave Oklahoma to move to New Mexico to become a temple builder again, as they were planning to build a new temple in New Mexico. The Supreme Council, with no discussion, elected Busby as the SGIG of Oklahoma. As a member of the Supreme Council, he began his usual enthusiastic leadership. And I'm not going into that because it really doesn't have any bearing on our talk tonight. But he was only there 4 years, in the Supreme Council, but I suspect if he'd have been there for a few more years, he'd have been at the top of the list. 4 years later, in 1913, William Busby died unexpectedly from a carbuncle on his neck that had become infected. Carbuncle. He was only 59 years old, so he came to McAlester when he was 49 in 1903 officially, and he died when he was 59. And all of these accomplishments, both Masonic and community-wise, were done in a 10-year span. And we've mentioned before, what would McAlester be like if he had lived another 10 years? And most of us figured we'd have been bigger than Muskogee. Anyway, Busby left a wife and 6 children. He was buried in a family plot in Parsons. In 1917, the mansion burned. Thereafter, the family moved back to Parsons, and there was no remaining family living in McAlester. Now, there are no statues, no streets or schools named after him, no memorials, nothing. Nothing to let the citizens of McAlester in later years know about the benefactor, this benefactor of the city. William Busby, the man who took a village and built it into a city. The mason who took a struggling lodge and built it into a headquarters for masonry in eastern Oklahoma. Shame on the city. Shame on McAlester, Scottish Rite Valley. This concludes the second installment of Great Oklahoma Scottish Rite Leaders.